The laundromat on Crane Street closed at 10. Ruby Monroe always stayed until 11, not from habit, but from the particular math of a woman who had nowhere pressing to be. She had finished the last fold at 9:43. The hour between closing and leaving was hers, and she spent it the same way every night slowly. Not because the work required it. The last load had finished tumbling at 9:43, and she had folded everything tagged, everything hung the dry cleaning in plastic sheets along the rod above the counter. She stayed because the walk home took 6 minutes, and the apartment waited at the end of it like a mouth that never said anything. At least here the machines hummed. She could feel them through the soles of her boots, a low vibration that traveled up through the concrete floor and into her bones, and that was something. That was almost like sound. Ruby was 28 years old and had been deaf since birth. She had never heard a voice, never heard music, never heard the silence that frightened people when it settled over a room. Her silence was different. Her silence was complete and total, and had always been that way, and she had made her peace with it the way you made peace with weather. You did not fight the cold. You put on your coat. She was folding a flannel shirt that belonged to old Mr. Garrett from 2 blocks over when the window beside the door went white with breath. She did not hear the hand hit the glass. She felt it. The vibration moved through the frame and into the wall, and she turned not because of the sound, but because something in the air changed the way air changed before lightning, a pressure shift, a wrongness. The fluorescent light above the counter threw everything in sharp relief. Outside the window, a face. She recognized him. Danny Roth came into the laundromat every other Thursday. He brought 2 duffel bags and always overpaid by $1 and never asked for the change back. He had a daughter somewhere, a little girl. He had mentioned her once proud the way fathers got proud when they did not know how to say it plainly. He was 34 years old and had a beard that needed trimming and always smelled faintly of motor oil. Tonight he smelled like copper. His hand left a print on the glass. He was pressing his whole body against the door, now one shoulder driving into it, and Ruby could see from the way he was angled that standing was costing him something. His left hand was pressed flat against his side beneath his cut. The leather jacket, she had seen it before. Iron Wolves, the name was stitched across the back in letters shaped like chains. She crossed the room in 4 steps and unlocked the door, and he fell against her. He was heavy, not just in weight, but in the heaviness of a man who had been running and had used up every reserve he had. She caught him under both arms and walked him backward to the long folding table in the center of the room, and he sat on the edge of it, and she could see now that his hand was dark with blood, and the flannel shirt beneath his cut was soaked through on the left side. She reached for her phone to call for help. His hand closed around her wrist, not rough, desperate. He looked at her directly the way people looked at her when they understood she read lips, and he spoke carefully and slow. "Do not call yet. Give me a minute, please." She looked at his side. He shook his head. "Not as bad as it looks. I need you to take something. Keep it. Do not let them see you take it." He reached into the inside pocket of his cut with his right hand, the clean hand, and produced a phone, not his personal phone. She had seen his personal phone. This was different. Older, a cheap prepaid model with a cracked screen sealed with a strip of electrical tape. He pressed it into her palm and folded her fingers around it. His lips moved again. "Everything is on there, everything." Danny made sure his eyes held hers. "If something happens to me, get it to Margaret Slater. She is a lawyer in Billings. She knows." Ruby stared at him. She looked down at the phone in her hand and back at his face, and she wanted to ask him 6 different questions, but he was already pulling away, already trying to straighten on the edge of the table. She could see it in his jaw. Whatever was holding him together was made of will and not much else. She dialed 911. They came faster than she expected. The red and blue lights swept through the front window 5 minutes after she pressed send, and she stood by the door and waved, and the ambulance pulled to the curb, and 2 paramedics came through the door with their kit, and Ruby stepped back and let them work. Then the second vehicle pulled up. It was a white SUV with a light bar across the roof. Not the sheriff department colors exactly. Close enough. 2 men got out, and they were not in uniform, or not quite the kind of almost uniform that said plain clothes but carried a badge. One of them she did not know. The other one she knew by sight because everyone in that part of Billings knew him by sight. Sheriff Dale Briggs was 52 years old and had held the same office for 16 years. He had a face that photographers like square-jawed and weathered, and he smiled well. And he had been in the Billings Gazette twice this year for charitable work. He sponsored a youth baseball league. He coached in it too some years. He came through the laundromat door, and he looked at Danny on the floor with the paramedics working over him. And he looked around the space, the machines, the folding tables, the long rod of hanging dry cleaning, the lit counter, and then he looked at Ruby. He was standing 8 feet away. The light was direct. She could see his face clearly. He looked at her for 2 seconds. Then he turned slightly toward the man beside him, and he spoke with the calm of a man who saw no reason to lower his voice because he did not believe he was being understood. "She is deaf," Briggs said. "She did not hear anything. She did not see anything." He paused. The other man said something she caught only the shape of. Then Briggs again. "Make sure she understands that." Ruby did not move. She did not change her expression. She stood with her hands at her sides and her face arranged in the careful neutral that a lifetime of navigating a hearing world had taught her, the face that said, "I am waiting. I am patient. I missed what you said. Would you repeat it, please?" She had worn that face so many times it lived on her like a second skin. Inside, she had gone very still in the way that was not peace, but its opposite. He thought she had not heard him. He thought she could not. And she understood in the span of a single breath that this was the only reason she was still standing in her own laundromat and not being handled, not being managed, not being made to disappear the way Danny was apparently being made to disappear. She had heard every word, with her eyes. One of the paramedics touched her arm to get her attention. He mimed writing on his palm, and she went behind the counter and came back with a notepad. He wrote down the name of the hospital and a phone number she could call in the morning for information. Danny was on a stretcher now. His eyes found hers once as they rolled him past, and she did not know what she saw in them. It was not gratitude exactly. It was the look of a man who had handed off the only thing that mattered and now had to trust a stranger with it. She nodded at him. He closed his eyes. Briggs stayed another 10 minutes. He walked the space. He looked at the machines, the counter, the window. One of his men took photographs. Nobody asked Ruby to write anything down, which told her that asking her questions was not the point of their being here. At one point, Briggs stood very close to the counter where Ruby was standing and looked at her again with an expression she recognized because she had seen it in various forms her entire life. The expression of a person deciding whether you counted. She kept her face patient and empty and waited. They left at 11:40. Ruby stood in the middle of the laundromat for 60 seconds without moving. Then she locked the front door. She turned off the counter light but left the machine lights on because she needed to think, and thinking required the low pulse of the floor under her feet. She sat on the folding table where Danny had sat, and she took the prepaid phone from the front pocket of her jeans where she had put it the moment Danny handed it over, and before anyone else came through the door. She did not look at it yet. She held it. Danny Roth came in every other Thursday. He overpaid by $1. He was proud of his daughter. He smelled like motor oil on ordinary days. And tonight he smelled like copper. And he had pressed this phone into her hand like it was the most important thing he had ever touched and told her that everything was on it. She looked at the window where his hand had left a print on the glass. She put the phone back in her pocket. She gathered her coat and her bag and turned off the remaining lights and went to the back door that opened onto the alley. She did not go out the front. She did not examine this decision carefully. Something in her body had made it before her mind caught up some old animal instinct that had nothing to do with sound. The alley was cold. Billings in late November ran about 19 degrees after 10, and the air hit her face like a wet cloth pulled from a freezer. She walked fast, collar up breath, coming in short clouds she could not see in the dark. Her apartment was 6 minutes north. She was 1 block from the laundromat when she felt the vibration of footsteps behind her. She did not turn. She walked faster. At the corner, she stopped under a streetlight, pretending to check her phone, and turned her body at an angle that let her see back down the block. 2 men. She did not recognize them. They were not in anything like uniform. They were walking with the purposeful pace of people who knew where they were going and were confident about getting there. She turned left instead of right, away from her apartment. She did not know this part of town the way she knew her own street, but she knew the general shape of it, the bar on Meade Avenue that stayed open until 2, the hardware store that was always lit, the big lot on the corner of Meade and 3rd, that was always full of motorcycles on weekend nights and sometimes on weeknights too. She had walked past it 100 times. The sign above the door was a wolf with its head back mid-howl, the painted teeth white as chalk. Iron Wolf Saloon. She turned the corner and onto Mead, and the lot came into view, and she stopped. There were 47 motorcycles parked in 2 rows along the front and side of the building. She did not count them in that moment, but she would count them later in the way that memory sometimes retrieved the details you did not know you had recorded. 47 bikes, most of them, Harley's chrome and black and the dark red that some people called ox blood. The lot was lit by 2 yellow security lights and the orange glow from the saloon windows. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the door and did not move. She was aware of exactly what this place was. She had heard it described or had read the descriptions, people in the neighborhood talking about the Iron Wolves MC, the way people talked about weather systems with a background wariness that did not necessarily mean panic, but did mean you adjusted your route when necessary. She had adjusted her route. For 6 years, she had adjusted her route. Behind her, she heard nothing, but that meant nothing. She looked down the block the way she had come. The 2 men had turned the corner. They were half a block away and walking, and one of them had a phone out and was looking at it and then looking up, looking for her. The saloon door opened. She did not decide to move. She was simply moving, crossing the lot between the bikes with her head down, her boot catching the edge of a curb she did not see, and stumbling and catching herself on the mirror of a parked Harley, and then reaching the door just as it swung out and she almost walked directly into the person coming through it. The person was small, maybe 7 years old. Red hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails, one higher than the other. She was wearing a purple sweatshirt that said Montana in white letters and jeans with a rip at the left knee. Her boots were rain boots with frogs on them, even though there was no rain and had not been for weeks. She was carrying a paper cup of something hot, holding it in both hands very carefully the way children carried things they had been trusted with. The girl looked up at Ruby. Ruby looked down at her. For a moment, they simply stood in the doorway, the cold coming in behind Ruby, the warmth and light, and the deep floor-level vibration of the saloon music coming from inside. The girl studied Ruby's face with the unguarded directness of a child who had not learned yet to hide her curiosity. Then the girl shifted the paper cup to one hand. She raised her free hand and made a sign. It was the sign for cold. Both hands' fingers spread, shaking slightly at chest level. The sign that was the same whether you had been taught formal ASL or had simply invented it from context the way children did when the people around them used their hands to talk. Ruby stared. In 6 years of living in this neighborhood, she had made exactly one friend who signed a woman named Deb, who worked at the post office and had a deaf son, and had learned ASL when he was an infant and retained it the way you retain the language of a place you loved even after you left. Other than Deb, Ruby navigated everything through notes and lip reading and the patience she had developed for waiting while people figured out how to talk to her. She had never had a child sign at her on a street in Billings, Montana at 11:50 on a Wednesday night. She signed back. Yes. Cold. The girl's face changed, not dramatically, a loosening. The expression of a person who had been waiting in a room where nobody spoke their language and had just heard from across the room a familiar word. She stepped back from the doorway and held the door open. Ruby went inside. The saloon was a long rectangle. Bar on the left, tables in the middle, booths along the right wall, pool table in the back. The music was classic rock, something with a heavy bass line that Ruby could feel in her sternum. The place was full, not crowded but full, the kind of fullness that said this was where these people were on this night, this was their place. Every person in the room wore a cut. The leather jackets with the patches, Iron Wolves across the top, Rocker Montana across the bottom. 40-something men turned to look at her. She had walked into rooms like this before. Not exactly like this, but rooms where she was immediately the wrong person for the space, the wrong gender, the wrong side, the wrong everything. She knew the way a room looked at you when you did not belong in it. She looked back at the room. The girl was beside her, still holding the paper cup. She tugged on Ruby's sleeve and pointed to a booth near the back. Sitting in the booth was a man. He was large in the way that some men were large, not just tall but substantial. The kind of body that suggested it had been built by work and not by anything deliberate, the accumulation of years of physical life. He had gray hair worn short and a beard that had gone mostly silver and was cut close to his jaw. He had a scar along his left forearm that she could see because his sleeves were pushed up despite the cold. His hands were wrapped around a coffee mug, and his eyes were already on her by the time the girl stopped in front of the booth. He looked at the girl. The girl signed something. Her signing was simple and imprecise, a child's vocabulary but readable. She found her outside. She is cold. She is scared. The man looked at Ruby. His face was not what she expected, not closed and hard and read this way out. It was watchful in a way that was different from threatening. The watchfulness of a man who had learned a long time ago to look carefully before he moved. He reached across the table and picked up a paper napkin. He turned it over to the blank side. He slid it toward her along with a pen that had been sitting on the table. She took the pen and wrote, "I need to sit down. People followed me from the laundromat on Crane. 2 men. I do not know who they are." He read it. He looked the way people looked when a thing they were already expecting arrived slightly ahead of schedule. He took the pen and wrote, "How long ago?" She wrote, 5 minutes maybe. I lost them when I came in here, I think." He looked up at the room. He made a small motion with 2 fingers, and one of the men near the front got up and went to the door and looked out and came back and gave a short nod. The man in the booth looked at Ruby again. He took the napkin and wrote one word, "Sit." She sat. The girl climbed in beside the big man, still holding her paper cup, and looked at Ruby with eyes that were the dark green of deep water. The man wrote again. He turned the napkin toward her. "My name is Rex. This is Chloe. You are safe here." Ruby looked at the word safe. She looked at Chloe, who was watching her with those dark green eyes, patient as water. She looked at Rex, who was watching her with a stillness that had been earned and not simply assumed. She wrote, "My name is Ruby Monroe. I work at the laundromat on Crane Street. A man named Danny Roth came into my shop tonight. He was hurt. He gave me something to keep. Then the police came, and I think they were looking for it." Rex did not change expression when she wrote Danny Roth. His jaw moved slightly. His hands around the coffee mug tightened for 1 second, and then relaxed. He looked at Chloe for a moment, and then back at Ruby. He wrote, "Danny is one of ours." She wrote, "I know. I have seen his jacket before." He wrote, "Is he alive?" She wrote, "When they took him, he was alive. They took him to St. Vincent's." Rex was quiet. He looked at the table. Chloe put her small hand on top of his big one, and he turned his hand over and held hers, without looking down, the automatic gesture of a man who had done this before, who knew the weight of a small hand and what it asked of you. Ruby watched this and felt something move in her chest that she did not examine. Rex wrote, "What did they say?" "The police." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about how to explain it, and then she decided that the simplest version was the truest one. She wrote, "The man in charge, I think it was the sheriff, he stood 8 feet away from me and told his deputy that I was deaf and that I did not hear anything and that they should make sure I understood that. He did not know that I read lips." Rex read this slowly. He read it twice. He looked up at her. His expression had changed in a way that lived between anger and confirmation, in the specific place where you kept the things you already knew were true but did not want confirmed. He took the pen. He wrote, "What is his name?" She wrote, "Briggs." Rex put the pen down. He looked across the room. He stood up from the booth and looked at the room, and every person in it turned to look at him, and then one by one, without being asked, they stood too. Ruby sat in the booth and looked at 47 men standing in a room because one man had risen from his seat. Rex looked at her. He took the pen one more time and wrote on the bottom of the napkin and turned it toward her. "You are staying here tonight." She looked at the words. She looked at Chloe, who was watching her with those dark green eyes. She nodded. Rex turned to the room. He said something she could not see from her angle because he was facing away from her. Whatever he said, 3 men moved toward the door, and 2 more moved toward the windows at the front, and the man nearest the bar picked up a phone. Chloe climbed out of the booth and came around to Ruby's side and sat down next to her. Very close. The way children sometimes did when they had decided without explanation that they trusted you. She still had the paper cup. She held it out toward Ruby with both hands. Hot chocolate from the color and the thin spiral of steam rising from the lid. Ruby took it. She held it. The warmth moved from the cup into her palms and up through her wrists, and she sat in the booth in the Iron Wolf Saloon with a silent child pressed against her side and a room full of men rearranging themselves around her like a wall. And outside, the November dark of Billings held whatever it held. And she did not know what was coming, but she knew that the cold prepaid phone in her jacket pocket was the reason Danny Roth had looked at her the way a man looked when he had handed off the only thing that mattered. She wrapped both hands around the paper cup. She breathed. Chloe leaned her head against Ruby's shoulder. The weight of maybe 50 pounds, the boneless lean of a tired child who had decided you were safe. Ruby sat very still and let her. She had not been leaned on in a long time. She had not been in a room where anyone had stood up for her in longer than that. Rex came back to the table. He sat. He looked at the two of them, and something in his face did something she did not see completely because she was not looking at him fully yet. When she looked up, he was already writing. He turned the napkin toward her. "Tomorrow we figure this out. Tonight you rest." She read it. She turned it over. She picked up the pen. She wrote, "The men who followed me. What happens if they come here?" Rex took the napkin. He looked at it for a moment. He picked up the pen and underlined the words he had already written. "Tonight you rest." He capped the pen. He set it down with the small, deliberate click of a man closing a subject. He picked up his coffee mug and drank from it and looked at the door the way men looked at doors they had defended before and were prepared to defend again. Chloe made a small sound against Ruby's shoulder. Not a word, just the soft, involuntary sound of a child fighting sleep and losing. Ruby looked down at the red hair, the uneven pigtails, the small body going slack with exhaustion. She looked across at Rex, who was still watching the door, and she thought about Danny Roth pressing a cracked phone into her hand and telling her that everything was on it. And she thought about Sheriff Dale Briggs standing 8 feet away and deciding out loud that she did not count. And she thought about the two men who had turned the corner and come looking for her in the dark. She thought about the word safe written on a paper napkin by a man she had met 40 minutes ago in a room full of men who had risen without being asked. She looked at the door. She looked back at Rex. He felt her looking. He turned from the door and met her eyes. She held up the pen. He passed the napkin back. She wrote, "There is something on that phone that someone wants very badly. I do not know what it is yet. I did not look. Danny told me to get it to a lawyer named Margaret Slater." Rex read it. He took the pen. "I know Margaret," she wrote. "He said she knows what to do with it." Rex nodded. He looked at the phone she had set on the table between them, the cracked screen, the electrical tape, the dull weight of it. He did not reach for it. He looked at her. He wrote, "You did not have to come in here. You could have kept walking." She looked at this for a moment. She wrote, "There was nowhere else to go." He looked at her steadily for a long moment. The music had changed. Something slower now, the bass still present, but the rhythm different, less urgent. Chloe had gone fully limp against Ruby's shoulder, asleep in the guileless, sudden way of small children who had decided the danger had passed, even if the adults had not caught up yet. Rex wrote one more time, "There is now." Ruby read it. She read it again. She set the pen down and wrapped her hands around the paper cup that was cooling now, the warmth fading but still there, still present, the way warmth sometimes persisted in a thing long after you expected it to have gone. Outside, the November dark held its cold. The men near the door held their positions. The motorcycles sat in their rows in the lot, patient in chrome, and somewhere across town in a hospital room, a man named Danny Roth was either holding on or letting go. And either way, the phone on the table between Ruby Monroe and Rex Donovan held everything that had gotten him to that room. Ruby did not know yet what everything meant. She did not know what was on that phone, or what it was worth, or what it was going to cost before this was over. She knew that she had read a crooked man's lips in a lit laundromat and understood that she was not supposed to exist as a witness. She knew that a child had signed a word at her in a doorway and changed the direction of her night. She knew that 50 pounds of sleeping girl was resting against her shoulder, and that the weight of it was the most real thing she had felt in a very long time. Rex drained his coffee. He set the mug down. He looked at the door one more time, and then he looked at Ruby and gave a single slow nod, the kind of nod that was not a greeting but a declaration, the kind men gave when words were insufficient and the gesture had to carry everything the words could not. She nodded back. The phone sat between them on the table like a thing that had not yet decided what it was going to become, waiting the way all important things waited for someone with enough courage to pick it up and look. She slept on a cot in a back room, that smelled like motor oil and old leather, and something underneath both that she could not name, something that might have been decades of men sleeping in the same space and leaving behind the residue of all their living. The cot was narrow, but the blanket was heavy and warm, and Chloe was asleep on a second cot 3 feet away, still in her Montana sweatshirt, the frog boots lined up neatly beside her like small soldiers standing watch. Ruby lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and held the prepaid phone on her chest with both hands. She had not looked at it yet. She had been not looking at it for 4 hours now, and the not looking had become its own kind of weight. Danny had pressed it into her hands with the urgency of a man who knew he was running out of time, and she had carried it through the cold and through the lot and into the saloon and had set it on the table between herself and Rex, and then had picked it back up when Rex went to talk to his men and had put it in her jacket pocket and carried it to this room. It was a small rectangle of cracked plastic and electrical tape, and it weighed nothing and it weighed everything. She turned it on. The screen lit up. No lock code. Either Danny had not set one, or he had removed it deliberately, knowing that whoever received the phone needed to be able to open it without instruction. The wallpaper was a photo of a little girl with red hair on a carousel horse, grinning so wide her eyes had gone to slits. The same red hair as the girl asleep 3 feet away. Ruby looked at the photo for a moment, and then looked at Chloe, and then looked back at the phone. She opened the photos folder first. There were 43 photographs. She went through them slowly, tilting the screen away from Chloe's direction out of some instinct for protection she could not have explained. The first 12 were of documents, contracts, from the look of them, legal-size paper photographed on what appeared to be a kitchen table, the flash reflecting off the surface and washing out some of the text but leaving enough readable. Property contracts. She could see the word Harmon repeated across multiple pages. She could see addresses, parcels, acreage numbers. She could see signatures on the bottom lines, and she could see on 2 of the pages a second signature that appeared in the witness line, the same signature on both, and the name printed beneath it was Briggs dead. The next photographs were of a piece of land she did not recognize. Bare winter ground, some scrub pine along a ridge line, a fence line running parallel to a dirt road. In the foreground of 3 of the photographs was a metal post driven into the ground with a surveyor's flag on it, bright orange, and beside the post a sign that said Harmon Development Group in red and black lettering she had seen on the billboards along I-90 coming into town. The last photographs were of the same land but taken from a different angle, and in these you could see a building in the background, a long, low structure set back from the road. She had to look at it for a moment before she understood what she was seeing. It was a clubhouse. The Iron Wolves Clubhouse, she realized, because she could see the sign above the main door, even at this distance, the wolf with his head thrown back. The Harmon Group surveying flag was planted in Iron Wolf's land. She put the phone face down on her chest and looked at the ceiling. Danny Roth had been killed, or nearly killed, because he had found proof that Wade Harmon was using forged contracts in a cooperative sheriff to acquire land that did not belong to him. Iron Wolf's land. Danny had spent weeks photographing those documents before they found out he had seen them. He had made a plan. He had chosen her. She thought about why. She would understand it better later from what Rex would tell her. Danny had said once that Ruby Monroe was the most honest person on Crane Street because she never pretended to understand something she had not actually seen. He had said most people pretended. She looked at the ceiling for a long time. In the morning, Rex was already at the table in the main room when she came out. He had coffee and a second mug waiting and a yellow legal pad instead of a napkin, which told her that whatever conversation was coming, he expected to need more room for it. She sat down. She slid the phone across the table to him. He looked at it. He picked it up and looked through what she had looked through, and his face did the same thing hers had done, the controlled stillness of a person absorbing information they had already half known, but now could not unknow. He went through it twice. Then he set the phone down and picked up the pen. He wrote, "How much did you see?" She wrote, "Everything. The contracts have your land on them. The surveying flags are at your property line. Briggs signed it as witness on at least 2 of the forged documents." Rex looked at what she had written for a long time. She wrote, "Danny told me to get this to a lawyer named Margaret Slater. He said she knows." Rex nodded. He wrote, "I will call her this morning. She has worked with us before. She is good." Then he wrote, "There is something else you need to know. She looked at him. He wrote, Danny did not make it. St. Vincent called at 4 this morning. He was gone by 3:15. Ruby sat with this. She looked at her hands around the coffee mug. She had known Danny Roth as a customer, as a man who came in every other Thursday and overpaid by $1 and was proud of his daughter. She had known him for 6 years, the way you knew people who move through the edges of your life, present and familiar but not fully seen. She understood now that she had not seen him at all. She looked at Chloe's cot through the open door of the back room. The girl was still asleep. She wrote, does she know? Rex wrote, not yet. She wrote, who will tell her? He wrote, I will. When she wakes up. She wrote, is there family? A mother. He wrote, Karen. Her mother. She is at St. Vincent's also. She has been sick for 3 months. Kidney failure. She does not know about Danny yet either. Ruby looked at the yellow legal pad covered in their handwriting. The back and forth of it, the conversation built entirely in ink and paper, the way her conversations always were, and she thought about a little girl in frog boots who had signed cold at her in a doorway and then pressed against her shoulder and slept. She thought about what it meant to be 7 years old and have the two people who stood between you and the world both be gone or going. Rex was watching her. She wrote, what happens to Chloe while her mother's in the hospital? He wrote, she stays here. She has been here for 2 weeks. The brothers look after her. She does not talk. She has not talked since the night Danny was hurt. But she signed to you. Ruby looked at this. He wrote, she has never signed to anyone here. None of us know ASL. Her mother is hard of hearing, and the family used signs at home. When Karen got too sick and Danny started getting into trouble, Chloe stopped talking entirely. We did not know how to reach her. Ruby looked through the doorway at the sleeping girl. She wrote, she reached me. Rex looked at what she had written. Something in his face shifted in the small way of a man whose careful management of his own expression had slipped for just a moment and shown what was underneath. He wrote, yes, she did. Margaret Slater arrived at 11 in the morning. She was 50 years old and drove a gray sedan that had logged 100,000 miles and was prepared to log 100,000 more. She was the kind of woman whose appearance said nothing about her until she opened her mouth and then said everything. She wore reading glasses on a chain and carried a briefcase battered at both corners, and she came through the saloon door like someone who had been through it many times before and knew exactly what she was walking into. Rex stood and she shook his hand and then looked at Ruby. Rex wrote on the pad, this is Ruby Monroe. She was the last person Danny spoke to. She has the phone. Margaret sat down. She looked at Ruby directly, not with the careful over-enunciation that some hearing people deployed when they encountered her, not with the slight elevation of volume that others used as though her ears were merely underperforming and needed encouragement, but with the ordinary directness of a woman who had already been told the relevant information and adjusted accordingly. She pulled her own legal pad from the briefcase. She wrote, Ruby, I am going to need you to tell me exactly what happened last night from the moment Danny came through your door. Every detail you remember. Take as much time as you need. They sat at that table for 2 hours. Ruby wrote and Margaret read and asked follow-up questions in writing, and Rex sat at the end of the table and read along and occasionally added something. They went through the timeline. The laundromat, Danny, the phone, Briggs and his deputy in the doorway, the 2 men who had followed her, the specific words she had read on Briggs' lips. When they finished, Margaret sat back and looked at the legal pad and then looked at Ruby. She wrote, you are certain of what you read, the exact words. Ruby wrote, she is deaf. She did not hear anything. She did not see anything. Make sure she understands that. I have been reading lips since I was 4 years old, I am certain, Margaret wrote. This is significant. A sitting sheriff explicitly acknowledging that a witness exists and directing a subordinate to intimidate that witness. Combined with the documentary evidence on the phone, this is the kind of thing that does not stay quiet, she wrote. I need to make some calls. I need to speak to the state attorney general's office. This has gone beyond what a local investigation can handle cleanly, given that the local law enforcement is compromised, Rex wrote. How long? Margaret wrote. Days, not weeks. The forged contracts are the core of it. Briggs's signature as witness is the link. The land survey photographs establish intent and timeline. She paused and then wrote, there is one problem. Ruby looked at her. Margaret wrote. To establish the chain of custody of the phone, I need Ruby to be available as a witness. That means she cannot disappear. It also means that Briggs and Harmon are going to find out quickly that the phone did not disappear with Danny and that someone has it. When that happens, Ruby becomes a problem they will want to solve. Rex wrote, she stays here. Margaret wrote, that is what I was going to suggest. Margaret returned that afternoon with a second person, a woman named Patricia Webb, from the State Attorney General's Fraud Division, who had driven up from Helena that morning. Patricia was 47 and had the manner of someone who had heard a great many things and was not easily impressed, but was currently, despite herself, focused with sharp attention on everything in front of her. But before Patricia arrived, Margaret asked Ruby to stay at the table alone with her for a few minutes. She closed her briefcase. She opened the legal pad to a fresh page. She wrote, Ruby, what I am about to tell you changes the shape of everything. Ruby looked at her. Margaret wrote, Karen Roth was not a random victim. 9 years ago, she worked in the administrative offices of Harmon Development Group. She was young, she needed the work, and she was good at her job. 6 months in, she witnessed Wade Harmon sign a land contract that she knew was forged. She had processed the original deed herself. She knew the owner had never agreed to sell. She saw Briggs sign as witness. She said nothing. She was frightened, but she left the company the following week. She changed her last name when she married Danny 2 years later, and she did not speak of what she had seen again. Margaret paused and wrote, Harmon found her 3 months ago. We believe he found her through Danny's association with Iron Wolves, whose land he had targeted. When he realized who Karen was, what she had seen, he understood she was the one thread that could unravel 9 years of transactions. That is why Danny is dead. That is why Karen is in a hospital bed, her body failing under 3 months of terror she could not speak about. She had been waiting for them to come for her, and the waiting nearly killed her before they had to. Ruby sat with this. Margaret wrote one more line. And that is why Chloe matters beyond what any of us realized. She is the daughter of the woman who witnessed the first crime and the man who documented the current ones. Harmon did not know about the child as a witness until recently. He does now, which means Chloe needs to be protected, not just because she is a child in grief, but because she is the living connection between everything Harmon has spent 9 years trying to bury. Ruby looked at the door of the back room. She looked at the frog boots she could see from this angle lined up beside the cot. She looked at Margaret and wrote, she signed something to me last night about the night Danny was hurt. She was at the window. She saw a man's face. Margaret went still. Ruby wrote, she is the only one who can tell me this, and I am the only one here who can receive it. Margaret looked at her. She picked up the pen. She wrote, then we need to make sure both of you are here to tell it. 3 hours after Margaret and Patricia left that first day, the power went out. Not just in the saloon. The block went dark. Ruby was in the back room with Chloe, who had woken up and been told about her father by Rex in the way that only Rex could do it, sitting on the floor. So he was at her eye level, speaking slowly enough that Ruby could translate into signs beside him. And Chloe had listened and had not cried, not immediately, and then had cried in the way that small children cried when something had broken that they did not have words for, yet her whole body involved in it, her breath coming in long, shuddering waves. Ruby had held her. There was nothing else to do. She had held her, and Rex had sat on the floor beside them both with his hand on Chloe's back, and the three of them had stayed that way for a long time. Then the lights went out. Rex was on his feet immediately. Ruby felt the change in the room before she fully processed what had happened. The machines going silent, the wall outlets going dark, the different quality of stillness that came with the absence of electric hum. She pulled Chloe closer. Rex was already at the door. One of his men appeared in the doorway. He spoke to Rex, and Ruby caught fragments from her angle. Harmon, the whole block, cut the main. Rex turned to Ruby. He held up one finger. Wait. He left. He came back with a battery lantern in the yellow legal pad. He set the lantern on the floor and knelt down to their level and wrote, Harmon controls the utility contracts for 3 blocks around here. He has done this before when he wants to pressure someone. It will come back on. It is a message. She wrote, What does the message say? He looked at her. He wrote, It says we know where you are. She looked at Chloe, who was pressed against Ruby's side, again quieter now, the crying done for the moment. The girl's eyes were open and tracking Rex's face. She was reading him the way children read adults when they knew something was wrong and were deciding whether to be frightened. Ruby signed to her, "You are safe. Rex is here. I am here." Chloe looked at her hands. She signed back small and tired. Okay, Rex watched this exchange. He picked up the pen. He wrote, "She signs more with you every time." Ruby wrote, "She is brave." He wrote, "Yes." Then he wrote, "She is also in danger. If Harmon knows about Danny's phone, he knows Danny had a daughter. He knows Karen is the one person who can testify to what she witnessed at his company 9 years ago. He found Karen through Danny. He will want to make sure there are no remaining threads." Ruby looked at this. She wrote, "I already told Margaret. Chloe signed in to me what she saw that night. She described the man who hurt Danny. She saw his face from the window. Rex went still. She wrote. She signed it to me. She knew the words for hurt and face. She showed me the shape of what she remembered. I do not know the man, but she does. She saw him clearly." Rex looked at the door of the back room. He looked at Chloe. He looked at Ruby. He wrote, "You are the only person she can tell this to." She looked at what he had written and understood fully what it meant. Not just that she was the only one in this building who shared a language with this child, but that the child's testimony existed in a form that required Ruby Monroe specifically to receive it and carry it forward. Without Ruby, Chloe's knowledge stayed locked inside her. A 7-year-old who did not speak and whose only language was ASL, sitting in a building full of men who did not know a single sign. She wrote, "I understand," he wrote. "Then you understand why you cannot leave." She wrote, "I was not planning to leave." He looked at her. He wrote, "I know. I wanted to say it plainly anyway." The second day, Patricia came back with a man named Gerald Ford from the State Attorney General's Fraud Division who had driven up from Helena the previous night. He had the look of a man who had spent 30 years reading documents that other people hoped nobody would ever read, careful and precise, and not easily distracted from the specific fact he was looking for. Gerald spread the photographs from Danny's phone across the table. He had printed them overnight enlargements of each one, and he laid them out in the order Ruby had found them. He wrote for Ruby, "I want to walk through these with you. Tell me what you observed when you first looked at them. Not what you concluded, what you observed." She went through each photograph. Gerald listened and made notes and occasionally wrote a follow-up question. After an hour, he sat back. He wrote, "The notary seal is the cleanest part of this. A dead man's credentials used on documents dated 14 months after his death. That is not ambiguous. That does not require interpretation. That is a fact that a jury can hold in its hand," Patricia wrote, "combined with the sheriff's signature as witness, the land survey evidence, and the testimony of the witness who received the documents directly from the man who photographed them." Gerald wrote, "I need 48 hours to prepare the filing. Patricia's office will coordinate with the state police, not the county sheriff. We will want to move on Briggs and Harmon simultaneously." He paused and wrote, "I will also need the child's testimony, not in a courtroom. A formal statement taken by a trained child advocate with Ruby Monroe present to translate." Rex wrote, "Ruby will be there." Ruby looked at him. She wrote, "Yes." Gerald drove back to Helena that afternoon with copies of the full evidentiary package, one for the Attorney General, one for the state police, one sealed in his own briefcase as backup. He was methodical that way. Ruby watched him go and understood that the machinery of accountability was now in motion, slow and deliberate, and not dependent on any single person to keep it moving. It was the third night when it happened. Ruby was asleep on the cot. Chloe was asleep on hers. The frog boots lined up as always, a drawing she had made during the day folded under her pillow, a motorcycle with a stick figure on it that she had signed to Ruby was Rex going for a ride. Ruby did not hear the door, but she felt the floor change. Not the deep settled presence of the building at rest, not the occasional footstep of someone in the night, but something sharper and deliberate. A pattern. 2 sets of feet moving with the controlled quiet of people who were trying to be silent and were nearly succeeding. Coming down the hall toward the back room. Ruby was upright before she was fully conscious. She looked at the door. The gap at the bottom showed a thin line of light from the hallway, and in that light she could see the shadows of feet. 2 pairs, stopped just outside. She was off the cot in one movement. She crossed to Chloe's cot and put her hand over the girl's mouth before she woke her, a gentle pressure, a warning. And Chloe's eyes opened, and Ruby signed with her free hand close to the girl's face where she could see it in the dim. Quiet. Stay down. Chloe's eyes were very wide, but she did not move. The door handle turned. Ruby grabbed Chloe with both arms and pulled her off the cot and down to the floor between the two cots, putting her own body between the girl and the door. The door opened. The light from the hall cut across the room. Two figures in the doorway, large, neither of them in any kind of uniform. Ruby screamed. She could not hear herself scream. She never could, but she knew the mechanics of it, the full expansion of her lungs, the vibration in her own throat, the way her mouth opened to its full extent. She screamed with everything she had, and beside her, pressed against her side, Chloe opened her mouth. One word. One word in the voice of a 7-year-old girl who had not spoken in 4 months, rough with disuse, barely formed but undeniable. Rex. It came from somewhere deeper than the silence, deeper than the grief and the fear, and the long months of not speaking. It came from the part of a child that knew without reasoning that the word for help was the name of the person who would come. It was loud enough. The door to the main room burst open. Rex came through the hallway in 4 strides, and behind him came the thunder of boots on floorboards. Multiple people and the 2 men in the doorway turned to face what was coming, and what was coming was not 1 man but 6, and Rex was first among them, and he filled the hallway in a way that did not leave room for discussion. Ruby held Chloe on the floor and felt the vibrations of what happened next through the concrete beneath them. She kept herself over Chloe, her arms around the girl's shoulders, her face turned into the girl's red hair. Breathing, 60 seconds, maybe 90. The vibrations changed in quality, became less urgent, became the stillness of a space where something had just been resolved. She looked up. Rex was standing in the doorway. The 2 men were not. She could see from the angles of the people in the hall that the situation had been managed. Rex came into the room and crouched down in front of Ruby and Chloe. He looked at Chloe. He reached out one hand and touched the girl's face very gently with the backs of his fingers, checking whether something precious was intact. Chloe looked at him. She said the word again, softer this time. Not a summons, but an acknowledgement. Rex. He closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them, they were wet. He looked at Ruby. His hands were shaking. She could see it, the fine tremor in the large, rough hands of a man who had held himself together through this entire thing and was now coming apart very slightly at the edges. He reached out and gripped her shoulder once briefly hard enough that she could feel it. She reached up and put her hand over his. She held it there for a second. She let go. He stood. He went back to the hall in the business of dealing with what had just happened, and Ruby stayed on the floor with Chloe and held the girl and felt her own heartbeat through her whole body, that primal percussion, that proof. Chloe signed against her chest, her small hands moving in the dark. She is safe. Ruby signed back. She is safe. You called him. You were brave. Chloe was quiet for a moment. Then she signed. I remembered his name. Rex came back 20 minutes later and crouched down again. He had the yellow legal pad. He wrote, "They are gone. My men have their names." One of them talked. He said Harmon directed his security coordinator, a man named Curtis Vane, to send them. Vane has worked Harmon's arrangements for 11 years. He told them to retrieve the phone and ensure the woman holding it understood she was not a witness to anything. Margaret has already been called. Patricia is calling the state police tonight. He looked at Chloe, who was sitting up now, leaning against Ruby's knee with her eyes half closed. He wrote. She spoke. Ruby wrote. She called for you. Rex looked at this for a long time. He sat down on the floor with his back against the wall and looked at nothing for a moment. He wrote, her father named me as her emergency contact 3 months ago. Before all of this, he came to me and said if anything happened to him, I was the one he trusted. I did not fully understand what he was asking. I think I do now. Ruby wrote, she needs you. She has nobody else right now, he wrote. I know. He looked at Chloe, who had given up on staying awake and was asleep again against Ruby's knee. He wrote, I had a daughter. She died 8 years ago. Her name was Annie. Motorcycle accident. She was 20 years old. Ruby looked at what he had written. She wrote, I am sorry. He wrote, she would have been 30 this year. He paused. He wrote, she would have liked Chloe. She would have liked you too. Ruby held this sentence somewhere it had not been addressed in a long time. She wrote, "Where?" He wrote, "Because you did not run, because you stayed for a child you had no reason to stay for, and you asked nothing back for it." She looked at the floor. She looked at Chloe's sleeping face. She wrote, "You stood up. When I wrote Briggs' name that first night, you stood up and everyone stood up with you. I had never seen that before." He wrote, "Seen what?" She wrote, "Someone stand up for someone they did not know, just because it was the right thing." Rex looked at what she had written. He picked up the pen. He wrote, "That is what this is supposed to be. All of it. Not what people think it is from the outside. What it is supposed to be on the inside," she wrote. "I know that now." He wrote, "Most people never find out." She wrote, "I found out because a little girl signed cold at me in a doorway." He looked at Chloe. He wrote, "She finds the right people. Danny used to say she had a gift for it." He was right. The child advocate came the following afternoon. Her name was Susan Boyle, and she had done this work for 18 years and had the manner of someone who had learned very specifically how to occupy a room with a traumatized child without the room feeling occupied. She sat on the floor when she came into the back room. She did not begin with questions. She looked at Chloe's drawings spread across the floor and pointed to one and looked at Chloe with genuine curiosity and waited. Chloe looked at her. She looked at Ruby, who was sitting beside her. Ruby signed, "She wants to know about your drawing." Chloe looked at the drawing. She picked it up and held it out towards Susan, the motorcycle and the stick figure. Ruby signed, "Tell her who it is." Chloe signed back, "Rex going to the ocean. He told me he goes to the ocean sometimes when he needs to think." Ruby translated this aloud. Susan wrote it down. They went slowly. Susan wrote a question and handed it to Ruby, and Ruby translated it into signs, and Chloe signed back, and Ruby spoke the response for Susan to write. It took 2 hours. Susan was patient with the precision of professionals who understood that patience was not a virtue, but a tool. When they came to the night Danny was hurt, Chloe's signing slowed. She had been at the window she signed. She was not supposed to be out of bed. She had felt loud voices through the floor and walls, and she had gone to the window in the dark and looked out. She saw her father in the lot outside. She saw 2 men with him. She saw what happened. Ruby translated this for Susan and kept her voice level. Susan wrote, "Can she describe the man she saw most clearly?" Ruby signed this to Chloe. Chloe thought for a moment. Then she began to sign not words exactly, but a description, built from the vocabulary she had tall. And then she touched her own jaw and moved her hand to indicate a shape, a feature. She signed a color, touching her own hair. She made a gesture Ruby understood as the way someone stood weight on one side, a posture held with the particular ease of someone who had never expected to be held accountable for anything. Ruby described this aloud. Susan wrote it carefully. This description would later be confirmed and would identify Curtis Vane Wade Harmon's personal security coordinator, who would be arrested 4 days later at his home in Billings with a phone containing text messages from Harmon directing him to handle the Danny Roth problem. But that was 4 days later. Today, Chloe finished her description and looked at her hands in her lap and then looked at Ruby. She signed, "Will this help?" Ruby signed back, "Yes, very much." Chloe signed, "Will the man go to jail?" Ruby looked at her. She signed, "We are going to try very hard." Chloe was quiet for a moment. Then she signed, "Daddy knew this was dangerous. He told me once that brave means doing something scary because the other people cannot do it themselves." She paused her hands. Then she added, "I think he meant you." Ruby looked at the girl's hands. She looked at the small, serious face, the dark green eyes, the red hair. She felt something move through her that had no sign and no adequate translation in any language. She signed back, "Your father was right." Chloe nodded once, the solemn nod of a child who has received important confirmation. The filing went in on a Thursday morning. Rex told Ruby over coffee on the yellow legal pad the way all their significant conversations happened in ink across a table. He wrote, "Patricia's office filed with the state this morning. Arrest warrants for Briggs and Harmon. The state police are executing them today. Simultaneous 2 teams, one at the county sheriff's office and one at Harmon's offices on Grand Avenue." She wrote, "What about the land, the contracts?" He wrote, "The forged contracts are void. Every parcel affected will be reviewed. The families who signed over property under duress will have their cases heard by a state land court. It will take time, but it will happen." She wrote, "Your land," he wrote. Our land was never actually transferred. They had not completed the process. The flags were anticipatory. Danny stopped them. Ruby looked at the name on the page. She wrote, "He knew what he was handing me." Rex wrote, "He spent 3 weeks photographing those documents before they found out. He had time to plan. He chose you because you were outside everything. No connections to the club, no family they could use against you, and because he trusted you. He told me once that you were the most honest person on Crane Street because you never pretended to understand something you had not actually seen. He said most people pretended." Ruby looked at the window. The November light came through it flat and gray and honest, the kind of light that did not flatter anything but showed you what was actually there. She wrote, "I want to go to the hearing." Rex wrote, "Margaret said you would." She wrote, "I want to be there when they have to account for what they did." He wrote, "Then you will be there." The state legislative hearing was held on a Tuesday in the second week of December in Helena, 3 hours from Billings. Rex drove it in his truck with Ruby in the passenger seat and Chloe in the back seat between Walt and a younger member named Price, who had volunteered for the drive without being asked and spent the first hour teaching Chloe a card game she won 4 times in a row. The hearing was not a trial. Briggs and Harmon were in custody awaiting separate criminal proceedings. This was a state oversight committee examining how a sitting sheriff had been permitted to act as a witness on fraudulent property contracts for a private development company for years without triggering any review. Margaret had explained to Ruby in writing the night before that it was the kind of hearing that changed things going forward. They wanted Ruby to speak. The committee room was smaller than she expected. Institutional carpeting, fluorescent lights, rows of chairs facing a long raised table where 7 committee members sat with their nameplates and water glasses. Perhaps 60 people in the room. Press in the back, Margaret was at her side. She had filed Ruby's written statement with the committee and arranged for an interpreter, a woman named Diane certified in ASL who would voice Ruby's signs for the room. Ruby sat at the witness table, Margaret beside her, Diane to her left. The committee chair was a man in his 60s named Harrison Webb, who had been in Montana state government for 22 years. He opened the session and read a brief summary and then looked at Ruby. He said, and she read it from his lips, "Miss Monroe, we appreciate your willingness to appear today. Please proceed at your own pace." Harmon's attorney sat in the second row with 2 assistants in a leather portfolio and the expression of a man preparing to dismantle something. Ruby looked at the committee. She began to sign. She told them what she had told Gerald and Patricia and Margaret. The laundromat, Danny Roth, the phone, the specific words she had read on Briggs' lips in the fluorescent light of her own shop, the words he had spoken, believing she could not receive them. Diane voiced it all. The room was quiet in the way rooms went quiet when they understood they were hearing something that could not be unsaid. When she finished, Harmon's attorney stood without waiting to be recognized. He said in a voice pitched to Carrie that the committee should consider the reliability of lip-reading testimony from a witness with a significant sensory impairment. Ruby watched him say it. She watched his mouth form the words, and she felt the familiar compression of being assessed and discounted. The feeling she had been having in various forms since she was 4 years old. She had spent 24 years living past that sentence in various forms. She did not sign her response. She stood up. She walked past Harmon's attorney to the whiteboard at the side of the room. She picked up a marker. She wrote slowly and precisely every word she had read on Dale Briggs' lips in the laundromat on Crane Street. She is deaf. She did not hear anything. She did not see anything. Make sure she understands that. She wrote it in letters large enough for every person in the room to read from their seat. She wrote it and then set the marker down and walked back to her chair and sat down. The room read what was on the board. They read it over Harmon's attorney's shoulder because he was standing between the board and the committee. And one by one, the committee members looked from the board to the attorney, and the attorney turned slowly to see what was behind him and read his client's sheriff's own words in black marker on a whiteboard in a government hearing room in Helena, Montana. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The committee chair looked at the attorney. He looked at the board. He looked at Ruby. He said, "Thank you, Miss Monroe. That will be sufficient." The criminal proceedings took months. The trials were separate. But the hearing produced something faster. 3 weeks after Ruby's testimony, the state announced a mandatory review process for all land transactions in which a local law enforcement officer had served as notary or witness in the preceding 10 years. Mandatory separation of law enforcement from private commercial property transactions. An independent oversight body for county sheriffs with the authority to investigate complaints regardless of whether local law enforcement cooperated. It was not everything. It was more than had existed before. Ruby read the announcement in the Helena newspaper at the table in the Iron Wolf Saloon with coffee beside her, and Chloe drawing on a notepad nearby, her tongue between her teeth, her focus complete. Walt was by the door. Rex was at the bar. She had been here for a month now. She thought about the laundromat on Crane Street sometimes, the folding tables and the vibration through the floor, in the 6-minute walk home to the apartment that waited like a mouth that never said anything. She thought about the way she had arranged her life to fit within that silence, small and manageable. Not happy exactly. Maintained. She set the newspaper down. 2 weeks later, they drove to St. Vincent's, all three of them in Rex's truck. Karen Roth was being released to a rehabilitation facility for the next phase of her recovery, and Chloe was going with her, and this was right and good. Ruby had known this was coming. She had known it since the night in the hospital room when she had watched the girl climb into the bed beside her mother and sign everything she had been holding. She packed Chloe's things the night before: the frog boots, the Montana sweatshirt, the drawings, the whole collection rolled carefully into a tube, the card game Walt had given her. She packed everything small and neat, and she sat on the edge of the cot afterward and held the frog boots for a moment before putting them in the bag. Karen was in a wheelchair when they arrived, thin and tired, with eyes that had seen too much recently. She looked at Ruby across the hospital room, the way women looked at each other when they had both been through the same fire and come out on different sides of it. She could not sign well enough for a full conversation. She took the notepad the nurses left by her bed, and she wrote and held it toward Ruby. He chose right. Danny always chose right when it mattered. Ruby read it. She looked at the window and breathed through her nose until the feeling passed. Then she looked back at Karen and nodded. They said their goodbyes in the parking lot. Chloe gripped Ruby's hand with both of hers the way her mother had gripped hers a moment before. The same gesture, something passed down. She held on for a count of 3 and then let go and turned back to her mother. Then she turned around again. She signed quick and clear. "You have to teach me more signs first." Ruby signed back. "Deal." Chloe signed one more thing, small and close to her chest, the signs of someone not entirely sure, but saying it anyway. Ruby smiled before she could stop herself. Rex was beside her. He had his phone out and had typed in the notes app and held it toward her. What did she say? Ruby took his phone. She typed back. She said she is keeping a space for me in her head next to Rex going to the ocean. Rex read this. He looked at the van pulling toward the exit, Chloe's red head visible through the back window. He looked at it until it turned onto the main road and was gone. He typed, "You ready?" She looked at the empty road. She looked at the parking lot, the hospital, the clean, sharp light of a Montana December coming off the snow. She typed back, "Yes." They drove back to the compound in the quiet that had developed between them over the past weeks, the quiet of two people who had run out of the need to fill silence because the silence itself had become a kind of language. Rex pulled into the compound lot and killed the engine and reached into the back seat and produced something she had not seen him put there. A leather jacket. He held it out toward her across the console. She took it. She held it up. It was a cut, the Iron Wolf's cut, aged leather worn soft with years the same patches the men wore. Her name was stitched on the front in white thread. She turned it over. Across the back above the Iron Wolf's patch was a single word, protected. She looked at it. She looked at Rex. He had his phone out. He typed and held it toward her. Not daughter, not member. Protected. It means what it says. Anyone who sees that knows what it means and who stands behind it. You earn this not by joining something, but by being exactly who you already were. She looked at the word on the back of the jacket. She looked at him. She took his phone. She typed, "I know what it means." She put the jacket on. The leather settled across her shoulders with the weight of a thing made to be worn and to stay. She zipped it and looked down at her name on the front, and then looked up at the compound, the lot, the saloon sign with the wolf howling at the white sky. Rex got out of the truck. She got out of the truck. They walked across the lot together, their boots on the gravel, the vibration coming up through her soles and into her body, the way all vibration did, the world communicating through the medium it had always used with her through contact, through closeness, through the direct transmission of one solid thing touching another. Inside the saloon, 47 men were waiting. Someone started clapping, then more of them. She felt it in the soles of her feet before she could see it fully, the percussion rising through the floor and into her legs and her chest and her throat. She stood in the doorway and felt them and looked at the room. These men in their worn cuts. These men who had stood up without being asked who had put themselves between a woman they did not know and the thing that was coming for her. And she looked at them and she thought of Danny Roth pressing a phone into her hands and saying, everything is on there. And she thought of Chloe in the doorway signing cold at a stranger on a November night. And she thought of the word on the napkin from the first night, safe. And she thought of all the ways a person could spend a lifetime being invisible and all the ways a single night could change the register in which the world received you. Rex stood beside her. The room held them both. She looked up at him. He looked at her. She signed the sign simple and direct, the vocabulary of a woman who had been saying things with her hands her whole life and had finally found a room built to receive them. She said, I hear you. He read her hands. He reached up and signed back. One sign. She had taught him one sign over the past weeks at the table with the yellow legal pad between them. She had taught him one sign because she had decided it was the one he needed to know. He signed. Home. She looked at his hands. She looked at the room. She looked at the words she still carried in her pocket, written on a napkin from the first night, worn soft at the folds. Now the ink still clear. There is now. Outside, the December wind moved across the Montana plain. Honest and without apology, the kind of cold that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. The motorcycles waited in the lot, patient in chrome. The wolf on the saloon sign held its howl against the sky. Inside, Ruby Monroe stood in a leather jacket with her name on the front and the word protected on the back. And she felt the room through the soles of her boots, the world speaking to her in the only language it had ever used with her, and she understood every word.